The flash of a camera's bulb was blinding, but not as blinding as the diamond necklace gracing the wrong woman's throat. It was the Starlight Collier from Cartier. A piece whispered about in hushed, envious tones across the city's elite, a piece Richard Vance had sworn was a surprise for his and Catherine's 5th anniversary. But here it was nestled against the porcelain skin of Tiffany Sterling, his impossibly young, impossibly blonde assistant. They stood on the steps of the Grand Oak Ballroom, a portrait of power and infidelity for the whole world to see. Little did Richard know, the real picture of the evening hadn't even been taken yet. Because just beyond the glare of the paparazzi, another car, a silent obsidian Rolls-Royce, was pulling up to the curb. The silence in the sprawling Upper East Side penthouse was a living entity. It breathed in the spaces between the minimalist Italian furniture and coiled around the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Central Park. For Catherine Vance, the silence had become a constant companion, a more faithful partner than her own husband. At 5 months pregnant, she felt like a ghost haunting the museum-like perfection of her own home. Her hand rested protectively on the gentle curve of her belly, a silent promise to the new life she carried. A life she had once naively believed would be the glue to mend the cracks in her marriage. Richard Vance, a man whose ambition was as sharp and cutting as his tailored Armani suits, had become a collection of echoes. The echo of his laughter from a time when it was meant for her, the echo of his footsteps as he left before sunrise, the echo of his voice on the phone, clipped and dismissive. "It's for the company, darling. You understand?" She always said she did. The evening of the annual Children's Health Foundation Gala had loomed on her calendar for months. It was the event of the season, a glittering affair, where New York's old money and new ambition collided in a symphony of champagne flutes and feigned camaraderie. It was also traditionally their night. Richard was a major benefactor, his company, Vance Holdings, a primary sponsor. Their attendance was not just expected, it was a performance. This year, however, the performance had been cancelled. 2 days ago, Richard had breezed into their bedroom, smelling of a perfume that wasn't hers, something sharp and synthetic, like cheap ambition. He had loosened his tie, his back to her, and announced he had to fly to Zurich for an emergency board meeting. A sudden merger, he'd said the words practiced and smooth. "It's unavoidable, Catherine. You know how critical this quarter is." He'd feigned regret, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. "You shouldn't go alone, not in your condition. Just rest. We'll make it up, I promise." The promise was as hollow as the rest of him. Catherine had learned to read the subtle tells, the way his left eye twitched when he lied, the slight tightening of his jaw. She saw them both. She didn't argue. She simply nodded at the dutiful wife and watched him pack a small suitcase with an efficiency that spoke of practice. The lie unraveled with humiliating ease. Her best friend Penelope, a sharp-witted art curator who saw the world in unfiltered color, had sent her the link that afternoon. It was from a gossip blog, Park Avenue Whispers, featuring a candid shot from the day before. Richard, very much in New York and not Zurich, was stepping out of a jeweler's on 5th Avenue. On his arm, clinging to him like expensive ivy, was Tiffany Sterling. Tiffany, his new executive assistant, a woman half Catherine's age, with a predatory smile and a wardrobe funded by a salary that seemed impossibly generous for her role. In the photo, Tiffany was laughing, holding up a black velvet box. The caption was snide and suggestive. "Looks like Vance Holdings is finalizing a very different kind of merger. Is Zurich the new code for the Hamptons?" The air left Catherine's lungs. It wasn't just the lie. It was the brazenness of it. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He was flaunting it. The gala was tonight. He had lied about Zurich to take her, to debut her. The realization hit Catherine with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just replacing her, he was erasing her. This gala, their night, was to be Tiffany's coronation. For an hour, Catherine sat on the cold marble floor of her bathroom, the phone lying screen up beside her. The silence of the penthouse pressed in, suffocating her. Tears she had held back for months finally fell hot and silent. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was about utter disrespect. It was about the 5 years she had dedicated to being his partner, hosting his dinners, charming his investors, standing by his side as he built his empire. It was about the child she carried, a child he had claimed to want, now reduced to an inconvenient footnote in his new narrative. Her grief, however, slowly began to curdle, hardening into something else. It was a cold, quiet fury. He expected her to stay home, to be the pregnant, forgotten wife, weeping into a silk pillow. He was counting on her dignity, her breeding, her unwillingness to cause a scene. He had underestimated her. He had forgotten who she was before she became Mrs. Richard Vance. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over a name she hadn't dialed in nearly a decade. A name that represented a different life, a different path, a time before the gilded cage had closed around her. Her finger trembled as she pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. A voice smooth as aged whiskey, and warm with a kindness she hadn't heard in years, answered. "Catherine, is everything all right?" She took a shaky breath, the resolve solidifying in her chest. "Sebastian," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I need a favor, and I need a date to the Children's Health Foundation Gala. Tonight." There was a pause on the other end, not of hesitation, but of calculation. She could almost hear the gears turning in his brilliant mind. "I assume Sebastian Thorne," said, his tone shifting from surprise to a low, protective growl, "that you have a point to make." "I have more than a point," Catherine replied, looking at her reflection in the polished chrome of the faucet. A woman with tear-streaked cheeks, but eyes of burning steel. "I have a declaration to make." The rain began to fall as Catherine spoke, fat, cinematic drops that smeared the perfect view of the city into an impressionistic blur. It was a fitting backdrop for the deconstruction of her life. On the other end of the line, Sebastian Thorne listened without interruption, a skill he had perfected long ago. He didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He simply absorbed her story, the casual cruelties, the blatant lies, the final public humiliation Richard had planned for her. Sebastian and Catherine had a history etched in the libraries of Columbia University, not the ballrooms of Manhattan. They had been inseparable, two scholarship kids, fueled by late-night coffee and a shared, ravenous ambition. He was a prodigy in computer science, seeing patterns in code that others couldn't fathom. She was a brilliant art history major, with a knack for identifying forgeries, a skill she now wryly acknowledged had failed her in her own marriage. They had dated for 2 years, a relationship of intellectual equals, of shared dreams, whispered in dorm rooms, but their paths had diverged. His tech startup had exploded, catapulting him into a world of venture capital and stratospheric wealth he had never sought but managed with quiet grace. She had met Richard Vance at a university fundraiser, swept away by his charisma and the sheer force of his ambition, which she had mistaken for strength. Sebastian had warned her, not in a jealous rage, but with the calm, analytical concern of a true friend. He sees the world in terms of assets, Kat, he had told her, over a final coffee. Make sure you're never just an asset. She hadn't listened. She had chosen the dazzling certainty of Richard's world over the uncertain, albeit brilliant, future with Sebastian. They had drifted apart, their contact dwindling to polite Christmas cards and the occasional shared headline in the society pages. Now, hearing his voice, steady and present across the chasm of 10 years, felt like finding an anchor in a raging storm. When she finished her story, her voice raw with unshed tears, the silence that followed was different from the one in her apartment. It was a thoughtful, supportive silence. His table is number 1. Front and center, I presume? Sebastian asked, his voice devoid of any "I told you so." Of course, Catherine whispered. He paid $500,000 for the sponsorship. He wants to be seen. He will be, Sebastian said, and for the first time Catherine could hear the ice in his tone. It was the calm, chilling voice of a man who didn't make threats, but rather stated inevitable outcomes. Give me 90 minutes. A car will be waiting for you downstairs. Wear the dress. The dress, Catherine was confused. The emerald one. The one you wore to the Visconti Gallery, opening 6 years ago. You said it was the only thing Richard ever bought you that felt like it was for you, not for his image. Wear it for yourself tonight. A wave of shock washed over her. He remembered. After all this time, he remembered a passing comment about a dress. It was a small detail, but it was everything. It was a testament to a man who listened, who saw her, who remembered the person she was, not just the role she played. After the call, Catherine moved with a newfound purpose. The lethargy that had clung to her for months evaporated, replaced by a crystalline resolve. She went to her closet, a vast walk-in cathedral of designer labels. She pushed past the muted, tasteful gowns Richard preferred, the beiges, the navies, the charcoals, and found it in the very back, encased in a preservation bag. The dress was a masterpiece of deep emerald silk that shimmered like a forest pool at twilight. It was elegant but daring, with a classic cut that would drape beautifully over her baby bump, accentuating it rather than hiding it. It was a dress of life, of vibrancy, not of mourning. As she slipped it on, she felt a piece of her old self click back into place. Next she went to her jewelry box. Inside lay the opulent, heavy pieces Richard had gifted her over the years. Diamonds, sapphires, rubies, all magnificent, all cold. They felt like property markers, brandings of his success. She ignored them all. Instead, she opened a small, worn wooden box tucked away in a drawer. Inside was a pair of delicate, vintage moonstone earrings. They had been a gift from Sebastian for her 21st birthday, bought from a dusty antique shop downtown. They weren't worth a fraction of the other jewels, but they held more value than all of them combined. They glowed with a soft internal light, a quiet defiance against the garish sparkle of Richard's world. Her makeup was minimal but precise, a sweep of eyeliner to accentuate the fire in her eyes, a touch of color on her lips. When she looked in the mirror, the woman staring back was not the wan, melancholic wife Richard had left behind. This was Catherine, strong, determined, and ready for battle. Punctually 90 minutes after her call, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Your chariot awaits." She walked through the silent penthouse, her heels clicking a steady rhythm on the polished marble floors. She didn't look back. As she stepped into the elevator, she caught a glimpse of a wedding photo on a console table. She and Richard, smiling, their eyes full of manufactured joy. For the first time, she saw the cracks in the photograph, the subtle forgery in their expressions. She felt a pang, not of loss for the man he was, but of mourning for the woman who had believed his lies for so long. The elevator doors opened onto the pristine lobby. The doorman, accustomed to Richard's fleet of expensive but soulless German cars, did a double-take. Waiting at the curb was not a Mercedes or a BMW, but a vintage custom-built Rolls-Royce Phantom, its black paint gleaming under the city lights like polished obsidian. A driver in a crisp uniform held the door open. As Catherine slid onto the plush leather seat, she felt the last of her fear fall away. This wasn't just about revenge. Revenge was a messy, emotional affair. This was about reclamation. She was reclaiming her story, her dignity, and her future. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly, silently, a vessel carrying her not to a party, but to the first day of her new life. The battle was about to begin, and for the first time in years, she wasn't fighting it alone. The Grand Oak Ballroom was a maelstrom of calculated glamour. Chandeliers dripping with crystals cast a golden glow over a sea of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos. The air thick with the scent of expensive perfume, and hothouse flowers buzzed with the practiced laughter and hushed negotiations of New York's 1%. It was a stage, and every guest was an actor playing their part. Tonight, Richard Vance had cast himself as the king. He stood near the grand entrance, a magnum of Dom Perignon in one hand, the other possessively placed on the small of Tiffany Sterling's back. She was radiant in a crimson gown, so aggressively tailored it seemed shrink-wrapped to her body. And there against her skin was the starlight collier, its diamonds catching the light with every sycophantic laugh she offered. They were the center of attention, and they reveled in it. Richard was at the apex of his power, a titan of industry, with a beautiful young woman on his arm, a public declaration of his virility and success. He greeted investors and rivals with the same magnanimous condescension, the unspoken message clear: I have everything. I can do anything. Gossip columnist Beatrice Fairfax, a woman whose pen could make or break reputations, watched them with narrowed eyes. It's a bold move, even for Richard, she murmured to her companion. Catherine is 5 months pregnant. To bring his little intern here, it's not just tasteless, it's a declaration of war. The whispers rippled through the room. Where was Catherine? Was she at home, heartbroken? Had she finally been discarded? The narrative was already being written. The tragic aging wife, replaced by a newer model. Richard could feel the speculation, the mixture of awe and disapproval, and it fueled him. He thrived on audacity. It was precisely at that moment, as the orchestra swelled to a crescendo, that the atmosphere at the entrance shifted. The clamor of the paparazzi outside, which had died down, suddenly erupted with renewed frenzy. The flashes were more intense, more frantic. A collective murmur rippled inward from the doors as heads began to turn. The doors swung open, held by 2 uniformed attendants, and there, framed in the grand entryway, stood Catherine Vance. Silence fell over the ballroom. It was not a gradual quieting, but a sudden, sharp intake of breath, as if the air had been stolen from the room. Catherine was breathtaking. The emerald silk of her gown cascaded over her pregnant form, not as a concession, but as a statement of regal femininity. The moonstone earrings cast a gentle ethereal glow against her skin. Her expression was not one of sadness or anger. It was one of serene, unshakable confidence. She was not a woman scorned. She was a queen arriving at her court. But it was the man by her side who turned the collective shock into stunned disbelief. Sebastian Thorne, the enigmatic billionaire, a legend in the tech world, who rarely made public appearances and never at events as frivolous as this. He was a man whose influence operated in the silent, powerful currents of data and finance, far removed from the gaudy theater of New York society. He was dressed in a simple, impeccably tailored black tuxedo, but he wore it with an authority that made every other man in the room, including Richard, look like a boy playing dress-up. His hand was gently placed on Catherine's back, a gesture not of possession, but of unwavering support. They paused for a moment at the entrance, a tableau of quiet power that completely eclipsed the gaudy spectacle Richard and Tiffany had created. Richard's face, which had been flush with triumph, went pale. The champagne flute in his hand trembled slightly. He stared, his mind struggling to process the scene. This was impossible. This was not part of his script. Catherine was supposed to be at home. Who was this man? He knew the face, of course, everyone knew. Sebastian Thorne, but the connection to Catherine was a devastating blank in his understanding of the world. Tiffany, sensing the shift in power, stiffened. Her smile faltered. The starlight collar around her neck suddenly felt like a cheap imitation, a gaudy prop. Every eye in the room was now on the woman she had been brought here to replace, and Catherine was effortlessly, devastatingly winning. As Catherine and Sebastian began to walk into the ballroom, the whispers erupted into a tidal wave. Is that Sebastian Thorne? What is he doing here with her? My God, look at her. She's glowing. Richard looks like he's seen a ghost. Beatrice Fairfax was already typing furiously into her phone. Forget the merger. The real story of the night has arrived. Catherine Vance, not in mourning, but in majesty, on the arm of the one man in this city who could buy and sell her husband 10 times over. The game has just been changed. They didn't head for a corner table. Sebastian guided Catherine with practiced ease directly towards the center of the room on a collision course with table 1. The crowd parted for them as if by royal decree. As they approached, Richard finally broke from his stupor. He put his champagne down with a thud and took a step forward, his face a mask of fury. Catherine, he hissed, his voice low and menacing. What the hell is this? What are you doing here? Catherine didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her calm expression a stark contrast to his barely contained rage. Before she could answer, Sebastian stepped slightly in front of her, a subtle but unmistakable barrier. He looked down at Richard, not with anger, but with something far more unnerving, pity. Good evening, Richard, Sebastian said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the sudden lull. I believe you know your wife. I'm just making sure everyone else remembers who she is, too. He then glanced at Tiffany, his eyes flicking over the starlight collier with clinical disinterest before dismissing her entirely. Lovely evening for a charity event. The message was clear. Catherine was not abandoned. She was protected, and her protector was a man whose power Richard couldn't hope to match. The king had been checked on his own stage in front of his entire court, and as Catherine met the stunned, furious eyes of her husband, she knew this was not an ending. It was the beginning of his. The ballroom, once a unified stage for Richard's triumph, had fractured into 100 hushed conspiracies. The air crackled with the energy of a scandal far more delicious than any affair. An affair was common. This was a coup. Catherine and Sebastian were the new center of gravity, and every satellite in the room was slowly, cautiously being pulled into their orbit. Sebastian led Catherine not to a random table, but to a one occupied by Harold Beaumont, the elderly, deeply respected chairman of the Children's Health Foundation, and his wife. Beaumont, a man of old money, and even older principles, had always been quietly skeptical of Richard Vance's flashy, aggressive style. "Harold, a pleasure to see you, Sebastian," said his voice, warm and genuine. "You remember Catherine Vance, of course?" Harold Beaumont's eyes, usually sharp and discerning, softened as he looked at Catherine. He rose a gesture of respect he rarely afforded anyone, and kissed her hand. "My dear Catherine, you look absolutely radiant. Pregnancy suits you. Please join us." The invitation was a powerful signal. The kingmaker of New York society had chosen his side. As Catherine and Sebastian sat, a waiter, seemingly appearing from nowhere, placed 2 glasses of sparkling water with lime before them. The message was subtle but potent. Their presence was anticipated and catered to. Across the room, Richard watched this scene unfold with a mixture of rage and panic. His table, the supposed seat of power, suddenly felt like a barren island. People who had been clamoring for his attention minutes before were now conspicuously avoiding his gaze, their eyes darting towards Sebastian Thorne's table. Tiffany, no longer the belle of the ball, sat stiffly, her smile frozen, the diamonds around her neck feeling more like a collar. "Who is he to her?" she whispered desperately to Richard. "I have no idea," Richard snarled, his mind racing. He knew Thorne by reputation, a recluse, a genius, a man who moved markets with a single decision. He had tried to get a meeting with Thorne's venture capital firm for months to secure funding for a new tech division at Vance Holdings, a project that was crucial for his company's future. He had been repeatedly and politely stonewalled. And now that same man was sitting with his wife, looking at her with a familiarity and tenderness that made Richard's blood run cold. He couldn't let it stand. He had to reassert control. Excusing himself, he strode across the floor, his path a wake of silence. He stopped at Harold Beaumont's table, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Catherine, we need to talk," he said, his voice tight with forced civility. He ignored Sebastian completely. Catherine looked up at him, her expression placid. "Richard, you're making a scene." "I'm making a scene," he hissed, leaning down. "You show up here on the arm of him after I told you to stay home. This is a deliberate attempt to humiliate me." It was Sebastian who answered, without even looking up from his conversation with Beaumont. "I believe your instructions were based on a business trip to Zurich. Was the flight cancelled?" The pointed question hung in the air, sharp and deadly. Several people at the neighboring tables choked back laughs. Richard's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He was being played with, openly mocked. He grabbed Catherine's arm. "We are leaving. Now." Before his fingers could tighten, Sebastian's hand shot out and gripped Richard's wrist. The movement was lightning fast and fluid. Sebastian didn't apply overt pressure, but his grip was like steel. He still didn't look at Richard, continuing his conversation with Beaumont, but his voice dropped to a near whisper that was meant only for Richard's ears. "Take your hand off your wife, Richard. You will not touch her again. You will return to your table and you will enjoy the rest of your evening. If you cause even the slightest distress to Catherine, I will make one phone call. And by the time the sun rises tomorrow, Vance Holdings will be a footnote in a textbook on failed hostile takeovers. Am I clear?" The threat was delivered with such cold, absolute certainty that Richard felt a genuine sliver of fear. This wasn't the blustering of a business rival. It was a promise from a man who had the power to execute it. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. He stared at Sebastian, who finally turned to meet his gaze. Sebastian's eyes were calm, but held the cold, infinite depth of the ocean. In that moment, Richard understood he was no longer the predator in the room. He was the prey. Defeated, he retreated to his table. The walk back feeling like miles. The entire ballroom had witnessed the exchange. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been shattered and remade. He was a king in his own court. For the rest of the evening, Catherine was the undeniable star. People flocked to her table, investors, socialites, board members of other companies, as all eager to pay their respects to see and be seen with her and Sebastian. She handled it all with a grace and poise that Richard had always taken for granted, but which now, in this new context, looked like untapped strength. She spoke intelligently about art with Penelope, who had arrived and joined their table with a triumphant grin. She discussed charity initiatives with Beaumont's wife. She was charming, witty, and completely in command of herself. Richard, meanwhile, was a pariah. His table guests made flimsy excuses and departed early. Tiffany sat in miserable silence, her big night having turned into a public shaming. The starlight collier, meant to be her crowning glory, was now a symbol of her spectacular miscalculation. Late in the evening, during the charity auction, the final blow was struck. The grand prize was a week-long stay at a private villa in Lake Como. Bidding was fierce, quickly reaching $200,000. Richard, in a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of his status, raised his paddle. "300,000, he boomed. A hush fell. Just as the auctioneer was about to close, a calm voice called out from Catherine's table. $1 million, Sebastian said, without even bothering to lift his paddle. The room gasped. The auctioneer was dumbfounded. He finally managed to stammer out. Sebastian leaned over to Catherine. "I hear Italy is lovely in the spring," he said softly for only her to hear. "A good place to rest before the baby arrives." It was the ultimate power play, an act of casual, breathtaking generosity that simultaneously supported the charity and utterly neutered Richard. It wasn't about the money, it was about the ease with which it was spent. Richard had offered a number to bolster his ego. Sebastian had offered a number to give Catherine a gift. As the gala wound down, Richard and Tiffany were among the first to leave, slipping out a side door to avoid the press. But it was too late. The story was already written. When Catherine and Sebastian finally rose to depart, they were met with a wave of respectful nods and admiring glances. As they walked towards the exit, Catherine felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. She hadn't screamed or cried or thrown a drink. She had simply shown up, reclaimed her name, and allowed her husband to immolate himself on the pyre of his own arrogance. Outside, the obsidian Rolls-Royce was waiting. The driver held the door, and as Catherine slid inside, she looked back at the grand ballroom, a place that had been the backdrop for so much of her unhappiness. Tonight, it had been the stage for her liberation. The war was not over, but the most decisive battle had been won, and she had won it without saying a word. The fallout from the gala was not a slow burn. It was a detonation. By 8:00 a.m. the next morning, Beatrice Fairfax's column was the most read article on the internet, complete with high-resolution photos. One photo in particular had gone viral, a split image. On the left, Richard and Tiffany, looking smug and triumphant upon their arrival. On the right, Catherine and Sebastian at their table, a portrait of elegance and power with Richard in the background, his face a mask of impotent fury. The headline was devastating. The Vance Gala. A king dethroned before his coronation. For Richard, the day began with a series of frantic phone calls. The first was from his chief financial officer, a perpetually nervous man named Gerald. The board is calling for an emergency meeting. Richard, Gerald stammered. They're concerned. About the optics. Optics, Richard roared into the phone, pacing his vast, empty office. It was a party, for God's sake. It has nothing to do with the company. It does when you publicly alienate your wife and she finds comfort with Sebastian. Thorne. Gerald squeaked. Thorne's VC firm, Titan Capital, holds a significant minority stake in 3 of our biggest commercial tenants. If he calls in his markers or influences them to break their leases, we're exposed. Terribly exposed. And the funding for the new tech division. Richard, the primary investor we've been courting, is a known partner of Thorne's. They cancelled their meeting this morning. No reason given. The blood drained from Richard's face. He had seen Sebastian as a personal threat, a rival for Catherine's affection. He hadn't considered the professional ramifications. Sebastian Thorne wasn't just a billionaire. He was an ecosystem. And Richard had just thrown a rock into the center of it. His second call was from Tiffany. She was hysterical. They're calling me a home wrecker. My social media is a war zone. She sobbed. Richard, you have to do something. Release a statement. Tell them we're in love. Don't be an idiot, Tiffany. He snapped, his patience gone. There is no we. You were a diversion. Now you're a liability. He hung up on her, the callousness of his own words barely registering. He was in survival mode. Meanwhile, Catherine was in a calm, quiet war room. She was not in her penthouse, which now felt like enemy territory, but in a discreet suite at the Carlisle Hotel arranged by Sebastian. With her was a woman named Eleanor Vance. No relation, one of the most formidable divorce attorneys in New York City. Eleanor, a woman in her 60s with piercing blue eyes and a mind like a steel trap, had been summoned by Sebastian at dawn. Your prenuptial agreement is ironclad, but it has a standard infidelity clause, Eleanor stated, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the document. Ordinarily, proving it can be messy and prolonged. However, your husband's performance last night has done 90% of our work for us. He didn't just commit adultery. He broadcasted it. We have a dozen society photographers who will testify under oath about his behavior with Miss Sterling. Catherine nodded, sipping her tea. She felt strangely detached, as if watching a film of someone else's life. Sebastian's team is also providing some ancillary information, Eleanor continued, a predatory gleam in her eye. It appears that Vance Holdings has been engaging in some creative accounting regarding its real estate valuations. Specifically, Richard seems to have used company funds to secure the lease on a certain Miss Sterling's very expensive apartment, and has been funneling money into a shell corporation that owns the jet he claimed to be taking to Zurich. This was news to Catherine. It wasn't just infidelity. It was fraud. The man she had married was not just a cheat. He was a common criminal dressed in a $1,000 suit. What do you want? Catherine Eleanor asked, her voice softening slightly. We can go for blood. We can ruin him completely. Or we can use this as leverage for a quiet, swift, and exceedingly generous settlement. Catherine looked out the window at the city below. She thought of her unborn child. She didn't want a life defined by a bitter public war with her ex-husband. She wanted peace. She wanted a clean slate. But she also wanted justice. I want what my child and I are entitled to, she said, her voice firm. I want our future secured. I want the penthouse. It will be my child's home. I want a settlement that reflects the assets he has hidden from me, and I want him out of my life, permanently. The terms are not negotiable. Eleanor Vance smiled. Excellent. The first legal salvo was fired that afternoon. A courier delivered a thick envelope to Richard's office during his emergency board meeting. As he read the first page, detailing the divorce filing, a freeze was simultaneously placed on all his personal and marital assets. He was trapped. The board meeting was a bloodbath, led by a stern, silver-haired director named Peterson. The members grilled Richard about his personal conduct and its direct financial impact on the company. Your public spectacle has jeopardized a 9-figure funding round and destabilized our relationship with our tenants, Richard Peterson thundered. Your judgment is compromised. The board is voting on a motion to suspend you as CEO pending a full internal investigation. Richard was reeling. His company, his kingdom, was being ripped from his grasp. He had thought himself untouchable, but in the space of 24 hours, the fortress he had built around himself had begun to crumble into dust. He stumbled out of the boardroom, dazed. His phone rang again. It was a number he didn't recognize. He answered it, desperate for any news that wasn't catastrophic. Is this Richard Vance? A slick, unfamiliar voice asked. Who is this? My name is Julian Croft. I'm Tiffany Sterling's attorney. We're filing a lawsuit for wrongful termination and emotional distress. Richard laughed, a harsh, broken sound. It was absurd. It was a circus. He hung up the phone and stared out his office window. The city looked the same, but his place in it had irrevocably changed. He had flown too close to the sun, and the fall was happening faster than he could have ever imagined. He had lost his wife, his company, his mistress, and his reputation all in a single day. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was only the beginning. The architect of it all was a quiet, unassuming man who had remembered the color of a dress from 6 years ago. A week later, the storm had not passed. It had merely entered a new, more dangerous phase. Richard, suspended from his own company and legally barred from accessing the majority of his wealth, felt like a man suffocating in a vacuum. The press was relentless, camped outside his office building, and the penthouse he could no longer comfortably inhabit. He was a prisoner of his own creation. Desperate, he did the only thing he could think of. He demanded a face-to-face meeting with Catherine. He expected to meet her in a lawyer's office, a sterile, adversarial environment. Instead, she agreed to see him at the penthouse. It was a strategic move designed to unnerve him, to remind him of the life he was losing. When he arrived, the silence was different. It was no longer the oppressive, lonely silence he had left behind. It was a calm, occupied silence. The scent of fresh freesias, Catherine's favorite, hung in the air, replacing the stale scent of his cigars. Penelope was there, sitting quietly in an armchair, a silent sentinel. And in the corner of the room, standing by the window and looking out at the park, was Sebastian Thorne. Richard's temper flared. I wanted to see my wife, alone. I'm not your wife anymore, Richard. Not in any way that matters. Catherine said, her voice calm and even. She was sitting on the sofa, a file folder resting on the cushion beside her. She looked healthier than he had seen her in months, the stress replaced by a quiet resolve. Penelope is my friend. Sebastian is my advisor. They stay. This was her territory now. He was the intruder. Defeated, he sank into the chair opposite her. He decided to try the one tactic he had always mastered: manipulation. He would play the victim. "Cat, look at what you're doing," he began, his voice laced with manufactured pain. "This whole thing, it's a nightmare. My company, my reputation, it's all falling apart. Because of one misunderstanding. A misunderstanding." Catherine's laugh was soft, but it cut him to the bone. "You taking your mistress to a gala where I was meant to be wearing a necklace you told me was for me, while lying that you were on another continent. That's not a misunderstanding, Richard. That's a business plan." He flinched. It was a mistake. A stupid, arrogant mistake. I was under a lot of pressure. Tiffany meant nothing. "It's you I love, Cat. It's our family, our child." He leaned forward, trying to project sincerity. "We can fix this. We can stop the lawyers. We can tell the world it was all a publicity stunt gone wrong. We can be a family." It was a masterful performance, the kind that had worked on her for years. But the woman sitting before him was no longer his audience. "It's incredible, Richard," she said, shaking her head with a sort of academic curiosity. "You really believe your own lies, don't you? You're not sorry you did it. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry you miscalculated." His facade began to crack. "And what? You found a richer Prince Charming to rescue you?" He sneered, gesturing toward Sebastian. Sebastian turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "This has nothing to do with me, Richard. This is about the choices you made. I'm simply here to ensure Catherine's choices are respected and protected." "My choice," Catherine said. "Picking up the file folder is to end this. Cleanly and quickly." She slid the folder across the coffee table. "This is a post-nuptial settlement offer. It's generous. It leaves you with your company, or what's left of it, and enough seed money to start again. In return, you will give me sole ownership of this apartment, full custody of our child, and you will walk away without a fight." Richard scoffed, opening the folder. "You're in no position to make demands. My lawyers will drag this out for years. I'll paint you as an unstable, vindictive gold digger who ran off with another man." Catherine met his gaze, and for the first time he saw a glimmer of the formidable woman Sebastian had always known. "No, Richard. You won't, because this isn't Act 1. This is Act 2. She nodded to Sebastian. He picked up a tablet from the side table and placed it next to the folder. He tapped the screen and a spreadsheet filled the display. It was a detailed flow chart of transactions tracing money from Vance Holdings' accounts through 3 shell corporations and into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. An account under Richard's name alone. The total was just over $50 million. Money he had systematically embezzled from his own company over the past 3 years. Richard froze, his face turning ashen. Where did you get that?" "You were so busy building your gilded cage." "Richard, you forgot that some people build the keys," Sebastian said quietly. "My cybersecurity team is very, very good. This is a complete record of your fraud, undeniable and prosecutable." Catherine leaned forward. "So this is Act 3, Richard. Your choice. You can either sign the settlement, walk away, and try to salvage your professional life. Or I can hand this tablet over to the SEC and the District Attorney's office. If you choose that path, you won't be fighting for your company. You'll be fighting for your freedom. You won't be paying lawyers. You'll be paying for commissary privileges. The life you know will be over. The room was silent. Richard stared at the tablet, at the undeniable methodical proof of his crimes. He had been so arrogant, so sure of his own cleverness. He had never imagined someone could simply peel back the layers of his deception with such ease. He looked at Catherine, truly looked at her. He saw the strength he had tried to extinguish, the intelligence he had willfully ignored. He saw the mother of his child, a woman he had wronged so profoundly that she was now holding a gun to the head of his entire existence. And he saw that there was no remorse in her eyes, only resolution. He had been playing checkers, they had been playing chess, and this was checkmate. Slowly, his hand trembling, Richard reached for the pen that Eleanor Vance had so thoughtfully included with the settlement documents. He uncapped it, the click echoing in the silent room like a gunshot. Without another word, he signed away his marriage, his home, and his future, all to save himself from his past. 9 months later, the first snow of winter was dusting the windows of a beautiful brownstone overlooking a quiet, tree-lined street in Greenwich Village. The home was filled not with a cavernous, echoing silence, but with the warm, gentle sounds of a new life, the soft cooing of a baby, the gentle rock of a cradle, the quiet murmur of a mother's voice. Catherine held her son Nicholas in her arms, his tiny fingers wrapped around one of hers. He had her eyes, but a peacefulness that was all his own. The penthouse on the Upper East Side had been sold. The proceeds, along with the generous settlement, had been placed in a trust for Nicholas, and had allowed Catherine to buy this house, a place that felt like a home, not a showroom. The saga of Richard Vance had concluded not with a dramatic bang, but with a series of pathetic whimpers. The SEC, tipped off by an anonymous source, had launched a full-scale investigation into Vance Holdings anyway. Richard, stripped of his CEO title and facing shareholder lawsuits, had been forced to sell his controlling stake in the company for pennies on the dollar to a competitor. He had avoided prison time, but he was ruined, a pariah in the world he had once ruled. The last Catherine had heard, he was living in a rented condo in Florida, attempting to launch a new venture that no one would fund. Tiffany Sterling, after her lawsuit was summarily dismissed, had disappeared from the social scene, her 15 minutes of infamy having expired. The Starlight Collier had been quietly returned to Cartier. Penelope was a constant welcome presence, a doting aunt to Nicholas, who arrived with organic baby food and scandalous art world gossip in equal measure. And Sebastian was simply there. He had been her rock, her confidant, and her fiercest protector throughout the divorce and the pregnancy. He had asked for nothing in return. Their relationship had rekindled, slowly, cautiously built not on the ashes of her old life, but on the solid ground of their shared history and mutual respect. There was no pressure, no expectation. He would come over for dinner, hold Nicholas, with a natural ease that surprised them both, and talk with Catherine for hours about everything and nothing. He was rebuilding her trust, not just in him, but in the very idea of a partnership. One evening, as they sat in the quiet living room, the baby sleeping peacefully in his bassinet by the fireplace, Sebastian looked at her. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked gently. The glamour, the galas. The power, Catherine considered the question. She thought of the cold, perfect penthouse, the heavy jewels, the constant performance. She remembered the gnawing emptiness that had been her constant companion. Then she looked around her cozy living room at the overflowing bookshelves, the half-finished painting on an easel in the corner. She had started painting again, and the sleeping baby, who was the center of her universe. "I didn't have power, Sebastian," she said, her voice clear and certain. "I was adjacent to power. I was an accessory to it. There's a difference." She met his gaze, a warm, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "This is power. Choosing my own life. Building a real home. Raising my son in peace. This is everything." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. His touch was warm and steady. It wasn't a gesture of possession or passion, but of deep, abiding friendship that was slowly, beautifully blooming into something more. It was a promise not of a gilded cage, but of an open door. Outside, the snow fell blanketing the city in a clean, white slate. For Catherine Vance, it was not an ending, but a new dawn. She had walked through the fire of a public betrayal and emerged not burned but forged. She was a mother, an artist, a survivor. And for the first time in a very long time, she was free. The future was unwritten, and she held the pen. And that's how one woman turned the worst night of her life into the beginning of her best one. It's a story that proves that true strength isn't about avoiding the fall. It's about how you rise. Catherine's journey from a heartbroken wife to an unbreakable mother shows us that sometimes you have to lose the life you planned to find, the one you were always meant to live. What did you think of her incredible transformation? Could you have been as brave as she was? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, if this story of resilience and reclamation moved you. Please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Click that notification bell so you never miss a single story of justice and empowerment.